The night I almost sold everything. The elevator stopped between the 36th and 37th floors with a sound like a coin catching in a throat. The panel flickered. The city outside the glass shaft looked too still for a Thursday. I could hear my breath bounce back off the brushed steel, hear my pulse in the rubber soles. A text from my lawyer, Neil, sat on the lock screen. They're already in the conference room. I had 30 minutes to become a different person or to stay who I was. Somewhere below, a vacuum quietly roamed the lobby like a small, dutiful animal. Somewhere above, a deal team arranged pens in parallel lines. "You okay up there?" came a voice from the speaker, tinny and calm. "Fine," I said, though my hands were shaking enough to make the elevator key rattle in its slot. I pressed my thumb into the edge of the metal until it hurt, the way I used to press reset on a router, hard enough to be sure the click was real. If the elevator moved, I would sign. If it didn't, if that quiet red 36 held its ground, I'd take it as a sign and walk. Superstition is a strange thing for someone who built his life on data, but that's the truth of it. The light held. I put my phone face down in my pocket, leaned my forehead on the cool wall, and let the silence stretch until the cables hummed again and the box resumed its climb. My name is Evan Cross, and if you've read about me at all, you probably read a version I barely recognize. The story always starts somewhere glamorous: NASDAQ lights, a palmed champagne flute, a jacket I don't own anymore, and skips the years that smelled like solder smoke and old coffee. I grew up in Lorain, Ohio, in a house that clicked in winter because the heating ducts were loose. My mom, Linda, worked nights as a nurse and spoke softly even when she was tired. My dad, Ron, tuned carburetors in a garage that never cooled down in August. We didn't say entrepreneurship. We said double shift. We said, "I'll figure it out." What I remember most are sounds. The squeal of the hardware store door on Saturday mornings, the little bell at Sal's diner that announced pie had emerged from the kitchen, the squeak of the grocery cart with the bad wheel, and light. The harsh blue of the school lab where an aging desktop hummed under a yellow post that said, "Please log OFF." Mr. Haskins, who taught everything from HTML to how to not trip over a power cord, watched me stay late enough times that he stopped pretending he didn't notice. "You again," he'd say, pushing a spare muffin across the desk. "You still hungry?" I was always hungry then, though not the kind that lunch fixes. The first thing I ever sold online was a box of broken routers I'd pulled from the electronics bin behind the strip mall. I cleaned them with a toothbrush, flashed an open-source firmware I barely understood, and listed them as for parts or repair, with photos taken on a disposable camera. A man named Travis in Des Moines bought 3 and wrote, "These actually work." That sentence felt like a door unlocking. Out on Route 6, the trucks threw up a noise like ocean surf, and I wondered how anything moved anywhere without breaking. Years later, that question would be the whole business. At 15, it was a feeling. I met Maya under a humming vending machine at Ohio State. I had taped a flyer for a study buddy app one was cobbling together in Python. She pulled it down and said, "Your kerning is a crime." She was a design student with a patience for small edges, baselines, grid lines, margins, that looked like snobbery until you noticed how much warmer the world felt when they were right. We ate noodles that tasted faintly of paper and traded tabs on each other's screens. "No more sign up today?" she said, fingers dancing over my copy. No one wakes up hoping to sign up. I didn't know it yet, but the habit of choosing words carefully would save me millions. 2 sentences can be identical in meaning and utterly different in impact. People are tuned instruments. I learned to listen. The first thing we made that anyone used was called Campus Loop, a rideshare that wasn't fancy enough to attract headlines, but was boring enough to work. You told it you needed a ride from the library at 11. It paired you with a stranger and a driver who kept the car clean. We launched on a Friday with 3 borrowed Toyotas. By Sunday, it was 60 cars and older grad students with legal pads asking if they could see our insurance. On Wednesday, a dean called to ask if we were competing with any university programs. On Friday, a journalist emailed us with questions I was too green to answer. "We'll get back to you," I typed, holding my breath. I took a long shower and realized I'd put our support email inside the privacy policy next to language I'd copied from a template because I liked the way it sounded. Maya tapped the screen with the back of a pencil. "You can't hide obligations in pretty sentences," she said. I didn't sleep well that week. Fact I didn't know at 19. The GPS in your phone would be useless if we didn't adjust the satellite's clocks for relativity. Time actually runs a little faster up there, about 38 microseconds a day, and if we didn't correct for it, your Bluetooth would drift into traffic. Someone thought about that for years before you even knew you could tap a map and see yourself. The humility of that still makes me quiet. Campus Loop paid our rent and bought us a second-hand Volvo we pretended was a company car. It taught us that the best software noticed what people forgot to say. I'm leaving 10 minutes late. I hate the stairwell by the south exit. Don't match me with the guy who plays the flute at midnight. We sold it for a price that would look cute later and used the money to move to Austin, where the summers stuck to your skin and the servers were cheaper. We had one desk, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard that echoed when you wrote on it. The landlord said, "No soldering," and looked directly at me. We called the next thing Hummingbird because we needed a word that wasn't already taken and because we wanted it to feel alive. The problem was simple to explain and complicated to solve. Most of the stuff that needed moving didn't need a full truck, but most of the algorithms assumed it did. Grocery chains were shipping air. Florists were throwing out flowers because traffic stole their afternoon. Small manufacturers would take a new order and then stall, eyes embarrassed, because the part they needed was a state away. We wrote code to treat empty space like a product. We listened to dispatchers who measured their days in coffee cups and routes. We watched drivers mark notes in the margins of laminated maps. Do not send me down this road after 3. The light at Cedar turns angry around school pickup. Reefers, one dispatcher told us, are what refrigerated trucks are called. I nodded like I knew. We tested the first live routes on a Tuesday. The office smelled like Sharpies and lemon cleaner. I wore the same shirt 2 days in a row because I thought it was lucky. You're superstitious, Maya said, smiling. I'm attentive, I answered, and then didn't like how that sounded. Luck is just the name you give to the side of the math you can't see. Money came slowly, then quickly. Janet Lowe at North Ninth Ventures met me at a coffee shop that tried to look like a chemistry lab. She listened without blinking and said, "It's dull. I love that." She wrote a check we celebrated by pushing 2 tables together at a taco place and ordering every salsa. The ones that burned your lips the first 30 seconds went best with the lime sodas. We made a list of decisions to make while the burn was high. We hired Thomas, who could make a database feel like a lake you wanted to swim in, and Bree, who could talk a person through a broken driver app at midnight while microwaving leftover soup. We rented a bigger office that still echoed. I made mistakes that felt like stepping into holes you didn't see on the sidewalk. We built a forecasting model that was beautiful, clean, layered, the kind that made you say, elegant, when you panned around it, and forgot to weight Fridays differently in summer markets where water sells like oxygen. The trucks idled with no orders. A grocer in Tucson ate the cost. He called me personally. "Evan," he said, "I'm not mad. I'm disappointed." Those words took me back to being 8 years old with the glue on my hands from a picture frame I broke and tried to tape back together, hoping the crack would look like a design choice. I refunded, apologized, stayed up 41 hours with Thomas recalibrating. The relief we felt when the graph turned upward again was the relief you feel when a fever breaks. We moved paper to pixels carefully. I didn't know this until a truck pulled up behind a warehouse and the driver, a 40-year-old named Nate with a daughter who collected dinosaur facts, looked at the new tablet we gave him and froze. He had the hands of a person who fixed things with pliers. "What do you do if it doesn't load?" he asked. "Call me," Bree said, and gave him her cell. He smiled and put the tablet under his seat. People don't change because you draw a diagram. They change because someone sits with them through a Tuesday that could have gone wrong. I saw Alina again at a confoundingly fancy wedding where the centerpiece was taller than the person who set it down. We had dated in a way that wasn't serious enough to call a mistake and wasn't casual enough to forget. She was writing long reads then, the kind that involved bus tickets and motel notepads. "You look like someone who sleeps with his phone on his chest," she said, and then gently moved the charger off the table so the cord didn't show in the photo. That night, she told me a story about a town that had one grocery store and a bridge that flooded, and how people stockpiled bread not because they were scared of hunger, but because they were scared of not being able to choose. "Control is a love language," she said. I thought about her sentence while we built a feature that lets small shops pre-book space on a truck 3 days out. Sometimes a line of code is just a person asking not to be surprised. We grew. The world hiccuped. In March of 2020, I stood at a window with the blinds raised and watched the highway turn into a film strip with missing frames. We were essential in that strange, loaded way that made pride and fear sit at the same small table. A bakery called crying because they didn't know how to sell without the smell of cinnamon in the doorway. A hospital called asking if we could move ventilator parts overnight if someone drove them to a half-lit parking lot. We built a marketplace in 10 days because we had to. If you need to move 2 pallets of canned peaches from San Bernardino to Boise by Thursday, this is where you click. The code wasn't elegant. It was fast and clean and kind. It held. We hired people who didn't need us to tell them why this mattered. We sent drivers coffee gift cards and a number they could call at 3 a.m. to hear a human voice. The world went quiet, then loud, then quiet again. Fact we learned staring at a logistics whiteboard at 2 a.m. A container ship can be longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall. If it wedges sideways, the world notices. The abstraction of supply chain becomes your kid's empty lunchbox. That spring, I watched our charts form shapes I didn't know lines could make. Spikes like teeth, valleys like missing stairs. We kept placing tiny bridges across them, one map update at a time. I stopped drinking coffee after 5 and started waking up at 4 to hear myself think. We hit our first 100 million in revenue on a Wednesday in July that smelled like cut grass. We celebrated by turning off our phones for 2 hours and eating burgers in the parking lot behind the office as the sun slung gold down the line of dumpsters. This is something, Thomas said, cracking a smile that made him look like the kid in his senior photo. It's something, I said. I didn't know what word to use. The ones you reach for in moments like that, unbelievable, amazing, incredible, are too sharp. Truth is quieter. My mother always cut the crusts off sandwiches and placed the knife exactly parallel to the counter's edge. When I bought her a house, she cried because the kitchen drawers glided silently on their rails. They don't catch, she said, opening and closing, as if she were testing time itself. My father accepted gifts like they were responsibilities and then stood out in the yard to look at them from a distance. He asked me once what a QR code was because he saw them taped to windows of closed stores. I told him it was invented in 1994 by a Japanese company called Denso Wave to track car parts. And now you use it to read menus, he said, shaking his head like you do when a dog learns a new trick. Whole world runs on leftovers, he added. He wasn't wrong. Money feels like water at first. It finds cracks in your belief system and widens them. I stood in rooms that made my shoes feel unqualified and listened to numbers with more zeros than my high school calculator could display. I learned the choreography of capital raises. The way someone says, this is the last we'll discuss valuation today, but leaves the door cracked. The way a junior associate's hair tells you if the partner slept last night. The way your own heartbeat becomes a metronome under your shirt. We chose investors who didn't flinch when we said we'd never sell user data. What if a strategic partner asks? Someone asked. They can keep asking, I said. Sometimes the only power you have is where you don't bend. The worst phone call of my career happened at 3:17 on a morning that could have been any month. We've got an incident, Bree said, voice stripped of everything extra. A carrier's password, reused and leaked from a third-party forum, had let someone peek where they shouldn't. They saw routes, not names, but that distinction is thinner in practice than in policy. We killed the keys, told the truth, paid for a forensic team that made my stomach hurt with their competence. I went on a live stream and said the things you say when you're in charge and you're scared and you're trying to make sure your fear doesn't infect the people who work for you. We will take care of this, I said. I could smell the coffee on my own breath. I looked into the green dot above the camera and pictured every person who had put a box with our label on it into a truck under a sky that didn't care what we called ourselves. After the call, I walked until the sun came up. A woman in running shoes nodded at me like I was part of a club I hadn't applied to. I thought about something trivial and anchoring, COBOL. A lot of bank transactions still run on code written in the 1960s. The world is stitched together by things that seem too old to hold. And yet they hold. I promised myself we'd honor that kind of durability. Not just speed. Not just cleverness. Staying. There were other people along the way. Jenna, who ran operations like a conductor and told me to keep my voice lower than my worry in meetings, because people don't copy your words, they copy your breathing. Priya, who arrived with a binder of carrier contracts color-coded by risk and a laugh that made you want to risk something. A guy named Cole who drove nights between Albuquerque and Amarillo and sent us photos of desert thunderstorms blooming in the dark like quiet fireworks. Emily, who came in as general counsel and told me one afternoon, low and kind, that my refusal to let go of a bad vendor was costing us more than my loyalty could pay for. "We can love people without renting servers from them," she said, and I, finally, agreed. The elevator night was 2 years after the IPO. We had rung a bell and pretended the sound wasn't recorded. I had worn a suit that didn't feel like mine. Maya had pinned a tiny silver bird to my lapel because she still liked how symbolism looked in photos. We went back to work while the world debated whether we were overvalued or just lucky. 2 winters later, a company with a name like a German appliance offered to buy us for a number that would have made the boy polishing routers in Ohio fall off his chair. I told myself I would be cold about it. Math, not memoir. We scheduled a closing. Then the elevator stopped. "Power test," the building manager said through the speaker. 2 minutes. There's a special kind of silence that lives in those suspended moments, a quiet that makes all your decisions line up behind each other like children waiting to go on stage. I leaned against the wall and remembered a girl named Sarah I dated for a spring who collected postcards and had a way of asking, in a whisper, "Are you here?" while we sat 2 inches apart. I remembered my mother closing drawers that didn't catch. I remembered Nate placing a tablet under his seat like it was a dog that needed training. I remembered the Tucson grocer forgiving me and not letting me off the hook. I decided that selling would make us smaller in a way the numbers didn't capture. The light blinked, the elevator hummed, and I walked into the conference room and said, "We're not signing today." A pen rolled to the edge of the table, stopped, didn't fall. That decision cost me polite headshakes and a few board members who wore their disappointment like cologne. It gave me a company that woke up again. We raised less money the next year and made more. We built an apprenticeship program for drivers who wanted to learn the dispatch side. We named the classes after highway birds, kestrels, falcons, swifts, and printed little patches you could sew onto a jacket if you felt like being corny. People did. We invested in a battery recycling startup run by a woman named Naomi who showed me the inside of a cell and made the chemistry sound like a bedtime story about ions that needed a safe place to go. We spun up a project in a small town where a factory had closed. We put the old break room back to work as a training lab. It smelled like coffee even after we replaced the carpets. Fact, we discovered the boring way. By running numbers that refuse to be impressed by us. The fastest route isn't the shortest, it's the most credible. A promise you can keep beats a promise you can't by a margin that compounds over years like interest on a savings account you forgot you had. People stay when the drawer doesn't catch. The whole world is a kitchen drawer. On winter mornings, I still wake before the sun. The house is quiet and the good kind of cold. I make coffee in a machine that hisses softly and stand by the window while the sky thinks about what kind of day it wants to be. Sometimes I read emails from drivers who send us photos of sunrises from rest stops. Sometimes I open old code and cringe and smile in the same breath. Sometimes I text Lena a quote from something I'm reading because we haven't dated in years, but we kept the part of us that could say, "Listen to this." Sometimes I write a line on a sticky note. Don't be clever when kind will do. I never expected the money to make me feel more responsible than free. To be honest, I thought the feeling would be the other way around. But wealth made me a librarian of my own choices, cataloging them carefully, knowing someone might ask to borrow them. At a 4th grade career day, I told a room full of kids that most of what I do is making rooms feel more honest. "Do you get to ride in the big trucks?" A boy asked, eyes wide. "Sometimes," I said, and he nodded like that was the real job anyway. Maybe it is. At night, when the city gets hushed and reflective and the streetlights turn the sidewalks into ribbons, I think about all the invisible adjustments that hold us in the right place. The satellite clocks that run just a little fast, the code none of us read anymore, but all of us depend on. The people who answer phones at bad hours and say, "Okay, let's figure this out." I think about the elevator hum and the way a small decision can feel like a lever moving a larger weight. I think about my mother opening drawers that glide and my father looking at a thing from the yard to make sure it will still look like itself tomorrow. That's the work. Not speed, not flash, but the quiet miracle of staying in tune. I keep a small metal bird on my desk, The pin from that IPO morning turned into a paperweight. It catches light in a way that makes the room feel smaller and larger at the same time. On the bottom, there's a scratch from the day it fell, back when the conference table was too smooth and I was too nervous to sit still. You can feel the scratch with your fingertip if you look for it. It's proof of gravity. It's proof that things go on. When I think about that elevator now, what I remember isn't the stuckness but the promise that followed. We built a company that learned to breathe slower when the world asked it to sprint. We learned to write sentences we could read out loud and still feel proud of. We learned that it's not disloyal to stop renting servers from someone you care about. We learned that the market isn't a god. It's a weather pattern, and wise people bring a jacket. We learned that a driver who texts you a photo of a storm might have saved 2 hours by pulling over. Trust is a time zone of its own. If you're listening to this, maybe you're falling asleep. Maybe you're in a kitchen that clicks in the winter. Maybe you're holding a phone over your chest, watching a blue dot settle into place because somebody, somewhere, remembered to adjust the clock. I hope the drawer slides. I hope the pen reaches the edge and doesn't fall. I hope you get the quiet hum that says, without hurry, we're moving again.